Welcome to My Life, Tanya Applied, with Rabbi Simon Jacobson, a journey into the deepest teachings of Torah and their application to our personal, emotional, and psychological lives.
A good Tavach and a good gebenchte Yar. We continue our journey in the life-changing Sefer Tanya. This program is made possible by Rena Lights LLC, and it's in honor and memory of Rav Yosef Alevi Weinberg Olav Shalom, Rav Moshe Pinchas HaKohen Katz Olav Shalom, Rav Yoel HaKohen Khan Olav Shalom. It's also in schus and merit of Rav Zev Yecheskel HaKohen, Risha Katz Le'erech Yomim V'Shanim Tevis, for many long and healthy years. And additionally, it's also in schus and merit of all the soldiers who are fighting right now to protect the innocent men, women, and children in Eretz Yisrael from our enemies. They should be matzliach, and it should be a year of total nitzachon and total peace for Eden in Eretz Yisrael and everywhere. We are closer to the end of Perek Chof Beis, chapter 22 in Tanya, and Alter Rebbe, in a continuation of his discussion that he began in chapter 20, to explain how the divine is the true reality of all of existence, and therefore also the opposite, that anything that is outside of that reality is a form of Avodah Zarah. Because he's coming to explain what he started in chapter 18 and 19, that because of the Ava Mesoteres, that every Jew has a sense of the divine, at least in a latent and dormant state within them, concealed, Ava Mesoteres. So when they're challenged, you see it come out. When they're challenged, whether they will, God forbid, serve Avodah Zarah or serve God, they're ready to give their lives, even Peish Yisrael and Kal Shebekalim. But that's only in the time of challenge. How do we see that all the time? So he's explaining how in truth that godliness, that is evoked, that emerges, that sense of godliness in a time of challenge, in a time of crisis and distress, is really there all the time. And that's the explanations that start in chapter 20, that go all the way through chapter 25. And he explains it because Anochi and La'yilecha, the two first commandments of the Seres HaDibros, encompass all the Torah. Anochi encompasses all the positive mitzvahs, La'yilecha all the negative mitzvahs, because they're both, all the mitzvahs are essentially, all positive mitzvahs are an expression of divine unity, and all negative mitzvahs, meaning not to do something, is an expression of the non-duality, therefore the non-Avodah Zarah of existence, because everything is godliness. So, after explaining what that means in earlier chapters, in chapter 22, he's explaining what is a Elikim Acherim. It's a result of the divine concealments that become so intense that you don't feel the divine, to the point that you could actually defy the divine godliness, and that's Avodah Zarah. So why is it called Elikim Acherim, as we learned? Because Acherim, from the word Acharayim, the way they receive their energy is from the back. It's like someone throwing a gift to someone, to an enemy, they throw it over their back. It's like unwilling, you have to give it to them because there's Bechira, free will, as we learned. However, you don't give it to them in a direct way. Who do you give in a direct way? Kedusha, who you love. There you give it face to face. What does it mean spiritually speaking? That the energy of everything that conceals the divine is a limited energy and a hidden energy, to the point of what's called Acharayim. But then he continues and says, and even the energy that is in there, in the minimal energy, is also in a state of Golus. That's where we stopped, close to the end of chapter 22. Now he's going to continue to say, therefore we have another reason it's called Elikim Acherim. Not just due to the energy that it's getting, that is getting it in a Acharayim way, meaning from the back, like a limited flow. But actually, Elikim Acherim, because it itself is indeed like Avodah Zarah. And denying the unity, the all-pervasive unity that exists, because it has its own identity, its own independent consciousness. That's fine if it's aligned to godliness. But if that independent consciousness becomes its own reality, its own ego, so to speak, then it becomes like Avodah Zarah mamish. That's what the next section we're going to learn right now. Okay. So he says like this, after saying that due to the Golus, say that Golus Mamish Betecha, so even this energy, even this back energy, meaning this diminished flow of energy, is in a state of Golus. Why? Because it doesn't want to be there, because it's defying God. It needs to be there because Hashem wants to also feed the other side, the Sitra Achra, in order for there to be free will, as we discussed at length in the last class. But the bottom line is, it's in a state of Golus. B'seid Golus Hashchina and Yiskalil. Well, the Chen Nikra, says the Alter Rebbe. Then he continues. And that's why it's called B'shem Elikim Acherim. What the Sitra Achra is called B'shem Elikim Acherim. In addition to what we said before, because it's receiving its energy from Acherim, from the Acharayim, not from the Pnim, not from the Ponim, from the face, which would indicate on a direct and an open flow, but here it's a diminished flow, coming only from the back. It's like a very limited and a very dismissive type of flow of energy. It's called Elikim Acherim, Shehi Aveda Zara Mamish. Which is Mamish Aveda Zara. Is it actually like idolatry? V'kfira b'achdusei shemelech malchei amlochim HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And a denial, and denies the non-duality, the unity of God, the King of Kings. He's going to explain now why. We already learned why, but he's going to spell it out. Ki ma'achar. So in other words, because the energy, the reason that is this way is because the energy is limited and it's coming in B'chinas Acharayim. But it causes that the very entity now is like an Aveda Zara Mamish. So Elikim Acherim, not just Elikim Acherim as in it's getting energy, but it's actually touching the word Elikim. That's like a false God, an other God, a replacement God for a bit of God. That's Aveda Zara. So we have the taich of Elikim Acherim, Elikim Shel Acherim, that others serve. We have the taich of Elikim Acherim coming from the energy of Acharayim, from the back energy. And now it's saying, no, the thing itself becomes like Elikim Acherim, like a false God. Aveda Zara Mamish. Which is denying the unity of God. Remember, the antithesis of Anochi Hashem Elokecha is talking about the all-pervasive and all-consuming divine unity. Do not have anything else outside of that unity. And when you do have something else, that's called Aveda Zara. Because the Eir V'chai is the Kedusha where it all originates. Remember, everything comes from an energy and a vitality of holiness. But now, how does it enter into the Sitra Achra? Yes, it enters in a limited way, but in a way that's in the form of Golus. Since it's Golus B'Seicha, Eina B'Teila Klal Gab Kedushas HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That means that the Sitra Achra is not bottled, it's not sublimated, it's not dedicated, it's not subjugated at all to God's holiness. And a simple example would be when two things are in relationship with each other and they love each other, so they listen to one another. They're submissive in a positive way. So when a God is giving, let's say, the Kedusha, the energy of godliness is going into Kedusha, into holiness, or going back to the example we spoke about, that the father wants to build a house for his children, and he loves them, so he gives it to them with a full chesed, with a full kindness, with a full glow, face to face. That's like b'chinas panim. If he's giving something to someone that he doesn't want to really give it, but only because for free will he has to give it, so to speak, has to. There's no has to, but he wants to because he wants to create that. So he's giving it begrudgingly. So you can understand when the relationship is a loving one, so both the one receiving it and the one giving it, the flow is a very smooth one. If you're giving something begrudgingly, I'm using it as an example, no, it's not. There's no real connection between the two. The one who's giving it doesn't really want to give it. He's only giving it for a side reason. The one that's receiving it is receiving it, but he doesn't really respect, because he has his own agenda. That's what he says. Let's just use an example. When a body is healthy, and the organs and everything is healthy, the flow of blood, of the other aspects, oxygen and so on, that sustain the body, are flowing smoothly. If God forbid there's an infection or an injury, what happens? There's a blockage. So the flow is not smooth. So when the flow is smooth is when the body is bottled. It's like a keli, that's like a transparent channel for the energy that flows in it. If for whatever reason it's not a keli, because it's not really interested in that energy, it's getting it because it needs it, but it's for own selfish reasons, then the flow is one that is not coming from a bittul dika place. It's like, let's for argument's sake, I'll give another example. The head of a company wants to give a bonus to his workers. But for whatever reason, he has to give the bonus to everyone. Not just to those that really worked well, but also those that is even ready to let go. But for whatever, because not to create machlekes or not to create arguments or other reasons, ulterior motives, he gives everyone the bonus. But he's not giving it to them the same way, because one is bottle, one has shown dedication and commitment to the boss and to the work. So he's getting it in a very direct and flow. The other one has defied, and the truth is he doesn't deserve it even. But he's giving it anyway. So that means he's not bottled to the one where he's receiving it. We're talking here, everything is sustained by godliness. Even the sitra achra, even though the things that defy God itself, that someone chooses badly and does something cruel to another person, you hurt someone else, God forbid. While you're hurting that person, you're getting energy from God. So how's that energy inside you? In the form of golus. But that means, like he says, ain't a potato, because it's in the form of golus, it doesn't really belong there. Because the truth is, a person like that shouldn't get energy. But for free will, God is giving energy. So it's in the form of ain't a potato kalal gab kedushas HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Essentially means not only that the recipient, the other side, sitra achra, is not appreciating, it's not even feeling the value of the energy that's giving it life. In Kedusha, you recognize all the time, and you thank God. There's gratitude, there's a acknowledgement. Moidani, I acknowledge that you're giving me life. Here, there's no bit like that. And that's indeed why, because that energy is in the form of galus, and that's why there's no bittul. And furthermore, and on the contrary, Magbia atzmo kenesher. This negative, this other side, inflates itself, inflates his ego, making himself as high as an eagle. He lifts himself up and it's like, kind of arrogance. So not only is he not recognizing and acknowledging the life force that's giving him energy, turns himself into a whole entity of his own, an arrogance. And the expressions comes from Yirmiyahu 49:16, Magbi Asmi Kanesher. Leimer, saying, claiming, Aniva Avsied, there's me and there's nothing, no one else besides me. That's from a verse in Yeshaya 47:8. So not only is he saying, okay, there's you and there's me. There's me and nothing else. It's completely self-centeredness, egocentric entirely. Ukamaimer, Ye'eli v'ani asisini. Pare said, made a statement, he said, the river is mine and I have made myself. This in Yecheskel 29:3 and verse 3 and verse 9. He's talking about Moshe Rabbeinu. He's approaching him. He says, God wants something from you. So he said, I don't need a God. Everything I get is from the river, the irrigation that the river provides. Because in Egypt there were no rains. And I am made myself. I'm a self-made person. I'm a God myself. This is the ultimate arrogance. Not only not acknowledging, because the energy is concealed. But remember, we said it's so concealed and so intense that it creates an entity that can defy God. Sitrach, which is called Elikim Acherim, Avodah Zarah. So firstly, it's not subjugated in any way to that energy. And more than that, it makes itself into a self-made, like as if I created myself. So you see here the extent of where this goes. And the Alter Rebbe's main point is to bring out how every time a person sees themselves that way, you don't have to be bowing to an actual idol. You become the idol. That's Sitra Achra. Anything that's not dedicated and not committed to godliness, committed to itself, that's Avodah Zarah. It's its own God. Elochein, Amru Rabbein Razal, Rabbeinu Zechreinu Levracha, and that's why our sages say, Shegasus Haruach Shkula K'Avodah Zarah Mamish. That inflated ego, Gasus Haruach, literally Ruach is spirit, and Gasus is like a thick spirit, a crass spirit. But it really means like an inflated, a pompous ego. Compares his equivalent to actual Avodah Zarah, to actual idolatry. This is the Gemara in Seita, Dalet Amud Beis, 4b. It's a big statement. How can you say such a thing? Avodah Zarah is Avodah Zarah. Gas Haruach is a terrible thing. But literally equating it. So the Alter Rebbe explains, Ki Iker R'Sheiresh Shel Avodah Zarah. What is the root and the source? Or the source, the Iker. The basis, and I should say Iker, the basis, the Iker. And Sheiresh, and the root of idolatry. Where does it come from? Hu masha nechshav l'dover b'fnei atzmei nifrim l'kdushasei shel makom. Is due to the perception of being an independent entity, autonomous entity, separate from God's sacred presence. That's the root of it. So going back to what we discussed, if there was no tzimtzumim, no concealments, divine unity would be all-pervasive and all-consuming and the only reality. Elikus b'pshitus. One is tzimtzumim, and God conceals. But more than just conceals. Conceals to an intense level, like we said, govru ha-tzimtzumim. Otzmu ha-tzimtzumim, that to the extent that it creates an entity that can go against God. Let's just go back to the actual lashon that he said. To that extent, they intensified to create to create impure things, the opposite of purity, the opposite of holiness. That means an entity that senses itself, and furthermore that it is a self-made entity, like we're learning here. So it's receiving the energy in a very limited way. That ultimately, that's the root and the source, that there's something separate. Like he says here, the perception of being an independent entity, I'm on my own. To the point, now I'm completely on my own. You can have being on your own and realize that you come from something greater. So there's still an ego. But here we're talking to the point of Aniva Afsiyed, me and nothing else. So now he's going further. So you could say, okay, this is Dafka, a person who completely denies God. He says, no. This conviction, but the independence, is not necessarily it's not yet a complete denial of God. And this is vital. Because if it's a complete denial of God, then it's Avodah Zarah mamash. But he's talking here, anything that doesn't feel that God is this total reality, is total sustenance, and feels there's something else, there's some independent force in between, that's also Avodah Zarah. As the Rambam explains, Avodah Zarah did not begin with the worship of something else. It began with identifying something that was God's creations and saying, I can relate to that, and that's God's messenger, the stars in heaven. Then it went further that we had to create shrines on earth to relate to those stars. And slowly, he explains in the beginning of Hilchos Avodah Zarah how that turned into pure Avodah Zarah. But it begins first, not necessarily denying God, but giving credence and value to something besides God. So, of course, the response is, Gazem biyad hachetzev. We know that everything is just an axe in the hands of the axeman. But if you give the axe some power of its own, then you're already treading in this area where there's something besides God. God forbid. So it's not kfira b'Hashem legamri. We're not talking about necessarily that level. And they bring Zaraya now from the Gemara. Kediyisa b'Gemara, like it says in the Gemara. This is the Menachos K'daf Kuf Yud Amud Aleph, in the Gemara Menachos 110a, that they refer to him, the Korele Elokah Delakaya. They refer to him to the God of gods. Now, if they have just Avodah Zarah, then they have their own God. Why are they calling him the God of gods? Because they have gods. They acknowledge that all the gods originate from the one God. So they acknowledge God's existence. But they maintain that he cannot directly connect us, and we can't directly connect them, so there's intermediaries. So that's the meaning. It's not complete kfir, there's no God at all. But there's value to the individual, to the point that you could say aniva avseid, where you could say l'chayr aniva avseid means me and nothing else, then you're denying even God altogether. So you have to say there are levels here. The most extreme where you deny it altogether. Elokad Delakaya is already, at least you're acknowledging the God of all gods. But the Alter Rebbe wants to bring not just the most extreme case where somebody simply says, I am God, like Li Ya'iri, like Pare. He said, he said, Li Ya'iri v'ani asasina, I created myself. Here, you're, even if someone doesn't completely say that and say, yes, God created me, but I have my own entity. I have my own independence. Like he says, Elashagam he machshivim atzmom liyesh v'davar b'fnei atzmei. So they don't deny God, but they can perceive themselves as autonomous entities and independent beings. Ubezeh, that too is already Avodah Zarah. Ubezeh mafridim es atzmei mikdusha shel mokim baruch hu. And this way they separate themselves from God's holiness. Because they're not bottled, they're not subjugated, they're not surrendering and dedicated to God. So there's a state where the worst possible is where you replace God. But here is even acknowledging God, but also I'm also a partner here. I'm also an entity. So this means, and you see the high standard that the Alter Rebbe is establishing, that's not just a person who's actually, God forbid, bowing to an idol that is unacceptable. But the mere fact that you feel, remember earlier we learned that the entire existence is Dvar Hashem, is God's words. And everything is completely batel and tafel, completely nullified in that presence. Furthermore, God's speech is not like ours, nothing is outside of him. It's all part of godliness. But God created tzimtzumim. Those are also real. That conceal that fact. To the point that you could think yourself as an independent entity. To the point that you could say there's nothing but me. Or even if you don't say that, you say there's a God, but there's also me. For as was mentioned earlier, and this is in chapter Vov, chapter 6 in Tanya, that holiness rests only on something which is completely surrendered to him. Or like we said, the keli is bottled to the eir. So a student, completely absorbing a teacher, the more he puts aside himself, the more he absorbs. That's Kedusha. Something that Sitra Achel is the opposite. Doesn't have that feeling. Even if it's receiving and drawing, because it wants the energy, but it sees itself as an independent entity, so it can't really receive it, like we learned before, in a completely pnimistic way. It's an acharayimdik way. But furthermore, it itself becomes now its own reality, its own independent value. U'lechein nikroim Torah de Pruda. B'Zeir HaKadosh. This also explains why in the Zohar, Volume 1, 158a, calls these negative forces are called divided mountain peaks, or divided mountains. Torah de Pruda. Torah is mountains, Har. De Pruda, separate. Harim nefradim. It's an expression, not like you have a mountain range, and you can sense they're all part of one entity. But then they're separate mountains, each one its own entity. This is what the Zohar calls klippus and sitra achra. Because it senses that independence and that autonomy, that yeshus. And this is when you don't have that bittul, when you don't have the understanding that you're part of the divine reality, but your own self. That's a denial of God's unity, His true unity. That the only thing that's real is godliness, the only thing. The kula kamei kelo chashiv, that in His presence everything is considered like null, kelo. Ubatel be'emes le'yizbarach, and all of existence is genuinely and truly voided before God. U'leritzene, to Him, to God, it's completely batel, and to the tzeni, and before His will. Hamachayes kulam u'mahava isamayin liyesh tamid. So not just to God as a creator, but also to God's will, which is extending all the time to sustain all things as kulam u'mahava isam, and brings them into existence constantly, ma'ayin liyesh, from nothing, like he explains later in Shari Yechud V'Amunah. Which before we learned, it didn't necessarily talk about Shari Yechud V'Amunah, but here you see he's bringing that, just strengthens the case, how everything is based on God's breath, God's words. B'dvar Hashem Shemayim Nasu. Take away those words, everything stops existing. And that's a kfir in this reality, in this truth, because you feel I'm on my own. Either I'm like my own God, or even if there's a God, I have my own independent personality. And that is ultimately a form of kfirah and denying the achduseh, which is avodah zarah, as the Alter Rebbe has been explaining here. And with this, he concludes chapter 22 in Tanya. Being that we just come from Rosh Hashanah is exactly that we come and dedicate our lives, like the other Marishan, called upon the whole creation, that we're not on our own. We are here all subjects of, creations of, ambassadors, channels of the divine in this world. That's the ultimate goal. It was very fitting to the themes that we're learning in Tanya to the time that we're in. Everyone should have a good gebenchte Yar, a Gemach Simeteva. Should be a year only of peace, a year of Geula. This has been Tanya Applied. We're here every Matzoi Shabbos, Saturday night, 10 p.m. Eastern Time. You can go to tanyaapplied.com for this and previous programs. Good Tavach and a good gebenchte Yar.
This has been My Life Tanya Applied with Rabbi Simon Jacobson. Please join us again next week. Visit chasidusapplied.com for archived classes and more resources.